I'd like to apologize in advance. As you see, there are only 3 of us. One of our moderators came down with COVID. Another one just came back from Cambodia and fell sick, so one of our speakers are down also. So it's just the 3 of us, and we were thinking to make it more casual, more cozy, and to do that, maybe you can come a bit closer, and then we can have a chat. Make it less formal, right?
So don't worry, we're not physically met, so not quite at risk of COVID also.
Yes. Okay, we'll sit further apart.
I think the last time we met was only Zoom, so I haven't figured out whether COVID can be spread through Zoom at this moment in time.
Yeah. Okay, let's start. Maybe a bit of introduction. My name is Jeremy. I'm from Caritas Singapore. I head the Fund Community Engagement and Development Department, which is in charge of fundraising, volunteer management, and communications for Caritas Singapore. I used to volunteer at Caritas Singapore. I was on their board until I stepped down last year and joined them as staff. So I've been volunteering and working with Caritas for close to 10 years. Okay. Maybe introduce yourselves.
Oh, okay. I'm Seng Bin. I'm trying to figure out which hat I'm supposed to wear. I'm actually a medical doctor, so this morning I couldn't join you as I was running a full clinics. I guess I'm here representing AMK-FSC as the chair of the board. Priscilla got me to come here, sit here, because she said that since I was the chair of the first volunteer resource committee, which came out with the first volunteer management toolkit. If you saw the result on the stage, she was the EY team that developed the volunteer management toolkit. So do go and look at the toolkit and see how it can help you in volunteer management.
Hi everyone, my name is Ivy. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Halogen Foundation. It's a youth development charity, so we are, our spectrum of work revolves around building programs that have character or mindset or soft skills development outcomes, and we actually run them partnering schools and social service agencies so that we could benefit students who may not have the opportunity or access to go for some of these programs that can uncover their hidden potential. So I guess I represent the hands on the working ground sense pertaining to volunteer management. Halogen has been around for 20 years. We only started engaging volunteers more intentionally maybe around 2015. And it started really just by having a functional role where there are people who just handles if any volunteers knocks on the door. We only hired our first full-time VM round about late 2017. So we have one full-time volunteer manager, and we recently, at the start of this year, added one executive to the headcount. So out of a team of 24, we have 2 full-time staff that are actually working on some form of community or volunteer management scope. So wanted to give some context, so later maybe we can take more technical questions if that's something that is of interest. Yeah.
Thanks, Ivy. I think we were also briefly discussing it earlier. There was a lot of discussion about importance of corporates, importance of partnerships this morning and as well this afternoon, more at a higher level strategically. And I guess since we are here, we are all bought into the fact that having partnerships is important, especially for sustainability and for making sure that we can get a good pool of volunteers to help in our work. We were thinking for this session, we could actually focus more on you guys in terms of what are your pain points, what do you think, what are the challenges you face that you might need some help, advice on, which all of us as a team, I guess we come up with suggestions and ideas to make it more of an informal, interactive session. Okay, so let's do that. Any questions? Do we have a pigeon? No, I don't think I see any. But if you have any questions, please feel free to raise up your hand and ask away. We can then start the ball going. Any questions? Any concerns? Yes.
Oh, partly because they're recording this.
Okay. So my name is Christina. I'm from the Turning Point. It's actually a halfway house for female drug offenders. So my biggest challenge is, I mean, there's a lot of support for children and for seniors, but then not much for vulnerable women. And I'm actually struggling to get volunteers to come to my halfway house, because it's actually a program from the prisons. So the girls, they serve the sentence their last few months at my halfway house. So in terms of security, there's a concern there, and also the knowledge that the girls need is quite vast, because we have residents from the age of 20 all the way up to 65. So one size program will not fit all. So I have to have a couple of programs and stuff like that. So getting volunteers to come in to do that part of the work is quite challenging. But anyway, I've been with Turning Point for 1 month now, so there's still a lot of things to do. So your advice for me to acquire and also retain volunteer partnerships in my area of work.
Thanks. Ivy, maybe you?
Yeah, I can get started on that. Interestingly, so we internally do try to track some of our statistics, right? So the funny thing was, when we ended our fiscal year last year, we saw that our numbers for volunteering actually doubled during COVID, because we had an option for Zoom or online related coaching sessions. And the irony is, now that the economy is somewhat opening and then there's all that revenge travel at the corporate side, we saw a dip. It's really ironic. But so I caveat that by saying that I think we're also trying to readapt to retaining. But acquiring, we've had some sort of a formula around it. I think how we started out was that, and in many times when we start with a volunteering need, we're basically looking out for gaps within the program that we need manpower support to. And initially, when we started out, like just, okay, here are the needs, and then we just listed, we realized that we weren't gaining that much traction with the corporates, because I think two major themes. One is they don't actually understand what we're asking of them, because it's not their language, so we can use all the fancy terms like come for our work session, come for this, and they don't get it, right? But when we said we'll send you a pre-read, like a lot of our corporate partners are like tech companies, MNCs and all that. When we tell them we send you a pre-read, when we send them a calendar invite for a dial-in meeting, being savvy with those things, that helped them like understand, so actually what is it? So I've been through some of the earlier pitches where we put together a deck, we go in and pitch, and then after the 1 hour where they were patiently listening, they say, so actually what is it that you want from us? Then I realized, oh crap, we kind of spoke in our language of what we need, and sometimes because we're very passionate about it, we end up, really seeing on the more outcomes, like these are all the goals. But I think so far, in all the opportunities that we had to knock on door, the fact that they would welcome a pitch time, they have a heart for it, but they don't understand the cause, and actually ultimately breaks down to what is simply that you need from me. Time, expertise, is it content? Like, I'm a finance person, can I volunteer like that? And so I think the step one is being able to speak the language. So along the way, we kind of leverage on whatever resources we have, right? With our staff who came from more corporate background, we're like, okay, if we write like that, you understand or not, right? Okay, they understand, great. If they don't understand, we ask another corporate volunteer, like, can you read this and tell us how to write it in a way that you understand? So I think that's a whole bit about the communication, and there's an iterative process for how that pitching process looks like. We've also had to do a bit of tweaks in terms of how we design the volunteering. So in our programs, we have a mix of short-run programs, but our longest program lasts for about a course of a year. And we have not been able to get anyone who can commit for a year, because when we tell them it's a year long, more often than not, the response I get is, such a heavy commitment. So what we decided to do, and it's kind of known as a trade-off, but then we figured, instead of having no one in the room because it's a year long, I'd rather have someone in the room, but I can break it down into smaller, shorter segments. And then where the blind spots are, I supplement it. So I explain, we want people to come in and spend time with the students in coaching some of their business plan ideas, because we use the entrepreneurship language as a way to help them dream about, think about something, critically think about something. So we want working adults, right, to really come and tell them like, this plan won't really work because it's not very practical. But if you ask them to commit for a whole year, you lose the volunteer ratio. And if you cut it down and ask them to come session by session, you lose the relationship, right? So we supplement our own youth. We recruited youth volunteers to go into the class to be that more befriender role, while we have the adults come in on a one-time ad hoc basis for the more technical role. So designing it in a way that helps. Yeah, so corporates that we talk to, sometimes they will come and volunteer. They realize that it's good to be more consistent. But that's it. If their boss asks them to go for a meeting, they would still, not prioritize that. So sad to speak, like this is the other part on the CSR bit that I think companies can do more of. But I think, I'll break it down to just acquiring the language of that corporate speak. And also rethink, you're the best bridge because you know your programs, you know your team members and what their needs are, and how can you redesign it in a way that is palatable for what, I mean, we tell corporates, this starter pack, if you like it, then you commit more, but just come for one session or two. And I think breaking it down helps. So that's definitely step one that I will recommend. On the retention, I think COVID is like throwing us in all different directions, so I don't really think I have very good advice for that. I will abstain from commenting. We're trying, still learning.
Actually, listening to what Christina mentioned early on reminded me of this time when I think this youth women's leaders group sort of invited me and a few of my colleagues to talk at a women's shelter somewhere in Serangoon. I think I'm not supposed to say where they are. And interestingly, I mean, of course, that group, you have different age plus children as well. So that was one of those sessions I was a bit crazy. I decided to bring drums down. Rather than just give a talk, I brought some drums down. I'm not sure if you heard of community drumming or drum circle. So basically what I did was just use it as an icebreaker before I gave a talk. If not, half of them will fall asleep, right? And I thought this group is quite unique, you know, the halfway house for this female. Not easy. I guess I was not invited back again because I'm not a female, as you would imagine. And I know some groups feel that, you know, they don't want to have a male in such setting. I'm not quite sure about what Turning Point views in such cases, but it is really looking at what are the professions that may be more suitable for such work. I mean, the healthcare, if you write to my hospital or any of the hospitals, there will be plenty of staff who will be willing to go down, whether is it a doctor, allied health professional, physiotherapists, or even psychologists. They may find it meaningful to contribute despite their busy schedule. And really, because this is a female group, whether you can find some of those female organizations that would actually resonate with the kind of beneficiaries you are working with, because they may, I mean, there's, right, I know I'm also put into a WhatsApp group that say FemTech, you know, and then suddenly they organize things at female leaders, then I'm like, can I attend? I'm not a female, you know? But there's more and more of such groups. I'm not quite sure if it's healthy to really exclude the male gender from it. I mean, after all, we should be inclusive, right? So really, whether you were talking about female tech, the male also need to understand what affects the female, and maybe their ideas will also provide a more holistic view. So I think in terms of the recruitment of volunteers, you could look at organization that truly looks at the vulnerable female clients, and then whether there are certain professions that are more suitable, because then you don't have to go through the screening process, right? Because the professionals have their professional body. If they do something naughty, they will be struck off the list. So that may actually help you in a sense. Because I know I'm not quite sure whether Turning Point is quite strict about having that security clearance before they're allowed in, because I know in prisons, if you are not cleared, you can't go to the prisons to do any form of work. So these are some of the consideration in terms of the volunteer screening and what are the groups that will give you more numbers. If not, you find it, I go to this group and they say everyone want to volunteer, then you end up, sorry, none of you qualify. I have to reject all of you, and it's a lot of effort on both your side as well as on the other side. And I'm sure once the volunteer work with such groups, it is how you sustain. I find that there are few ways of getting volunteers, the individual ones, or you get individual and you form a group so that they slowly grow as a group, or you work with the universities like the educational centers. They will tend to have a certain CCA that maybe every year they will adopt a charity. The only problem you have is after 2 years or when they graduate, you have another new group coming in. But at least for the 1 or 2 years, that helps you to be more sustainable. And some of them do really come back to volunteer. So I find that informal group helps. I mean, I'm looking at my own volunteering experience. When I started off, we didn't have giving.sg, you know. I only read this Straits Time, and then they say down there, we need volunteers. Then I call. I called for 2 days, I couldn't even get through the line. Yes, that was so difficult. It's like you want to volunteer, but it's so hard. Then I was in the army on Saturday afternoon. My friend, hey, I'm going for this interview. I said, okay lah, just hitch it along lah. So instead of one, the volunteer manager got 2 to interview. Thankfully, she didn't kick me out of the room. So, but now you have more opportunities, and I know giving.sg do provide such an opportunity. I'm not sure if you have tried that manner. And how do you onboard? Do you want to have an onboarding as an individual, or do I want to onboard as a group so that the group can grow together? So these are some of the thoughts you can put into so that you can see. I mean, it depends on your needs. So sometimes it may be better to be individual, sometimes it may be better as a group. Because as a group, sometimes we support each other, right? It's like job shadowing. Oh, I can't volunteer today, can you go on my behalf? And that also helps you to be more sustainable, because most of us have our, we have competing interests. And sometimes, especially in Singapore nowadays, if you're trying to earn a decent living, you have to travel. Your company is going to send you somewhere, and if you are traveling, then who else can take up that slack when you're not around?
Thanks, Prof. I think you made a good point. I mean, when planning to recruit volunteers, especially from corporates, it's always good to do some research, right? Find out maybe go to the website and see who they focus on, and quite a few of them focus on women or children or elderly, right? Then you target those, right? And then you have a higher chance of success. And to Ivy's point, you know, I think sometimes corporate volunteers might find it scary to volunteer with beneficiaries. I used to work in Dementia Singapore, so that is also people think that people with dementia are violent and stuff, right? So they have that perception, and they make it. They find it. When they come to us, corporates want to volunteer with us, they feel that there are a lot of questions in their mind, right? Because they think people with dementia can be violent, and it's also up to you to change their minds, to educate them, right, and assure them that they're not, and actually break it down to bite-sized volunteering opportunities, as Ivy was saying, and then slowly ease them in. And once they get to know you, once they get to know your beneficiaries, then they will stay longer with you and and support your cause, I guess. Okay, hope that helped answer your question. Any other questions from the crowd?
Hi, I'm Jocelyn from Ng Teng Fong General Hospital. So I'm actually doing volunteer management in the hospital. So we are very blessed to have a volunteer team there. Just wanted to check, because we are talking about acquiring volunteer partnership. I'm very curious to know about your stories about taking that first step to reach out to corporate volunteers. Any challenges, and how do you resolve it at the end of the day? Because I myself, we are looking for corporate volunteers to come into the hospital to engage patients. So just wondering if you could share some of your stories, your challenges, and your resolution to the challenge. Thank you.
I just wanted to supplement a small point because Dr. Ang actually alluded to the part which is, I spoke about the getting the language and designing, right? But I think Dr. Ang mentioned a very important point also that's embedded somewhat in the design very subtly is choosing your target audience. So like for Turning Point, actually, I think depending on what the scope is, you might also decide what kind of profiles of volunteers you need. For example, for us, we need volunteers to be able to make weekday slots. We don't have weekend slots because we follow a school calendar. We also are okay to have people who are just coming in for 1 or 2 times, which means an average corporate working adult is a good profile fit. Right, the quite reverse is also true because some companies only want to volunteer on weekends because they see it as part of their family time. And also if you're looking at something with a bit more commitment, then you might actually want to look for, there's this very huge community of people who knock on our doors and they say, I'm doing actually freelance coaching, I'm a coach, I have time to volunteer, and they have very flexible schedules, and they have some basic primer in understanding how to facilitate conversations, which might be a really good target pool of audience if you have a more complicated volunteer stint that you need someone with good effective communication skills and be sensitive, right? So on the topic of partnerships, I think when we first started, we just went for low-hanging fruit. If got people volunteer, we were happy already. And largely because we didn't have a team, we started going for tech companies or MNCs or banks, companies with a substantively larger size, only because we couldn't figure out how on earth to screen someone who sends in their LinkedIn. And then you look at it and you go like, they started 4 companies, but you have never heard of any of them and they want to give back. So because we didn't have the ability to do any form of screening, we tried talking to one of them, then we realized, maybe different varied motivations. So we decided, you know, if we have limited bandwidth, let's prioritize. And if we can work with an organization, at least I have the ability to go back to the organization and go, by the way, your volunteer was a little odd. Could you speak to her? And I really encountered some before. I had a volunteer from a pretty established company. I have never had volunteer issues with that organization, and they usually come with their CSR shirts. But there was one day where, to my horror, and I don't get to go to ground a lot, but incidentally it just happened before me, there was this lady wearing a mini skirt with her volunteer shirt, like mini skirt with high heels, and she sauntered into the room and sat with her the coachee student who's a boy. And I was like, oh my gosh. So I joined the group and I sat there throughout. And then at the end of the day, we went back to tell the volunteer coordinator. And so sometimes their hands are a bit tight because they may be a CSR team, they may be just a volunteer, they may be shot an arrow to be part of a CSR committee, whatever it is, at least we felt like it was a good platform that we could go back and tell them like, hey. So when we started, quite honestly, it was really trying to go for what works. Those who were too fancy, like we had people who toss us a 6-page resume and say, can you go and figure out where I'll be best placed to volunteer for you? And we go, oh yeah, thank you. And then we let it fade out, you know? So I think as a start, so we call one of our programs a starter pack because the cost of impact of not so good volunteers is low because we are there. But we want more volunteers because there will be more airtime with the students. So we have, internally, we earmark like this is, all else fails, right, you're not sure, right, just always send the person to this because you can observe them and you can see whether they are really interested. If they are not driven by the right reasons, for us, thankfully, usually they'll fade out. Because after a while, they realize they don't get the eyeballs that they want, they cannot like put it on their resume. I have no idea, but there's really a range. Or it's too difficult, like it's not what they thought. You know, very easy, I want to share my expertise, but how come the person doesn't want to respond to me? So we have some programs that you can creatively set up, and even like your pre-trainings, like if some of them want to volunteer for something a bit more technical and they can't even make time for 1 hour, 1.5 hours on Zoom with camera on, then I think chances are maybe good to fizzle that out. So we learn also to not be like you know, 宁缺毋滥, right? You just take. You rather have less than have like everything, but then they come in all shapes and sizes that have an impact on the people that we're trying to serve. And I think for us, our first corporate partnership just came as a result of Starter Pack. they volunteer. They're like, hey, that's kind of cool. It fits my kind of volunteering schedule. Do you have needs? We said like we have a lot, and they are like very happy because the company also wants volunteerism. And so that was how we officiated our first partner. So I'll qualify this partnership as mainly volunteering, because if you want to volunteer, then get donation, that's another longer haul track. So all our partners start off with volunteering. And it's been quite useful. And I think over time you get to know which are the partners that are more suited in terms of profile. Because to some extent, the companies also come with a bit of their own culture. Yeah. So you've seen, we've worked with some that when they want to scout a volunteering opportunity, they will send a whole fleet of their boss to all come and observe first. Very more traditional, so they want to see everything first. Then they allow you to post one volunteer ad, like, okay, you can try recruit. Then there are some who technically don't care. They're like, okay, just give me the flyer, I'm gonna upload it on our portal, and you're like, just like that? Okay. So I think you have to experiment a little bit, but I would encourage a starter pack and creatively putting some primers in there. Like if they're not gonna fill up a volunteer form, even though it's very onerous, I think try not to force it through lah. Just, okay, consider if you're so busy for the volunteer form, you won't be actually being attentive to that. And then the other part where we do take in individual volunteers now, what we do is, because we have a volunteer team, we have a process of kind of doing a screening. So sometimes we'll batch them together, we'll ask them to dial in for a 1-hour briefing, just to know who we are and what they've signed up for and what opportunities they want to dive into. And through that process, actually, because we have to ask them questions and get to know them, then we can actually have the avenue to hear how they phrase their stuff, and like why do they want to volunteer. So in some ways that has helped us filter out. And in all else, someone's very enthusiastic but they're not suited for the partners that we're serving, the youth that we're serving, we try to get them to volunteer with us. That means maybe they are very good at some operations thing, like, could you take a look at our manual and help us out? Some people like that, at the end of the day, they just want to volunteer, but they don't know what the needs are. So, sorry, I didn't tell you any juicy stories, because I'm trying to think of like, yeah, the one that was very vivid was the mini skirt and high heels. It's like 6 years ago and still is etched in my head. Yeah, sorry. I'm done.
Just curious, what are the roles you'll be looking out for volunteers to play in Ng Teng Fong? Okay. I'm curious, I mean, we know that all hospitals are short of staff. Wouldn't you want volunteers to help you with some paperwork, some administrative work? Because while we always take those mundane tasks as not voluntary work, I do know a volunteer say, I enjoy photocopying, I enjoy filing, and they could actually be very good help. And it reminds me of this time when I visited this volunteer association in Hong Kong. It's quite interesting. They will have let's say if you're a regular volunteer, say 2 hours a week, they will consider you a regular. But if you hit something like 10 hours a week or something to the extent, you become a full-time volunteer and they give you transport allowance, which is not much. Maybe it pays for the transport and maybe your lunch. But if somebody puts in the amount of time, then maybe it may be worthwhile. It's something that we can really think about in terms of the longer term sustainability, because these volunteers also need to eat their lunch. This thing about performance, you know, I work quite closely with the musicians and artists, and I always feel sad for them because they always say, oh, can you volunteer? But to them, that's livelihood, you know. And already COVID is very sad when I see musicians who used to be playing in restaurants or in a hotel, they have to become a Grab driver just to make ends meet. How do we balance this part? I do know that Esplanade and NAC do give grants for some of them to do this. I guess students might be an easier thing to do that, But how do we structure it into something more meaningful that can make it, so that I go back every week. I'm looking forward to the next one that I'm doing, not just performing on the stage and then after that the audience goes away. So I think as a volunteer, when I look back myself, if there's no personal growth, you will be disillusioned and you will quit, because there was this thing that we used to do for the low-income family when I was in Students Care Service, or now called Shine and Children's Services, whereby every Saturday we'll organize this thing called supervised play, where they'll drop off their kids. Then we'll bring them, we'll organize some games, we'll do something at the playground. And after a while, some of the volunteers started to question this, Hey, we're like childcare center, we're minding our kids, we're not having an impact. But that's because they don't realize that what they are doing actually helps this child to develop. So I have to explain to them, this boy, I still remember this boy, he couldn't go up this, this ladder, this circular ladder on the playground, because he was just not confident enough. But I said, don't worry, you climb up. If you fall down, I'll catch you. The moment he reached the top, he just went up and down, it's like multiple times. But that simple act would have give him something that he may never have achieved. But if we don't share with the volunteer to say, what is it that you're going to make an impact on somebody, they will think that I'm just there being made use of as a free service, rather than making that impact. So we need to also inculcate in our volunteer, what is the impact that you have brought to our, maybe our patients. If you play music, a stroke patient starts to move the left arm, you see his left arm is moving, even though he's supposed to be paralyzed on that side. And these are some things that will motivate them to contribute more. And so how do we create this narrative? How do we curate the volunteer work? It's still the same thing, but you're curating it such that we are going to show that impact he has made on this beneficiary.
Okay, thank you. And do you think, have you answered the question? Or?
So again, is the how do you maintain this partnership? AMK, we work with NCS, and they were doing, so they were actually supervising our so-called low-income kids or the vulnerable children to take part in the robotics competition, and they managed to get into, I think, the finals, and they were competing against the likes of RI, Hua Chong. So that also brings back, as I said, when the volunteers now see the impact on the children, see, these are from neighborhood school, which if we never help them, they wouldn't be competing against the elite schools. And that will keep them, we'll encourage them to come back for more. Of course, they have been donating quite a fair bit to us on a yearly basis. Back in Shine, we had HSBC that come down every week. But of course, the reading program called the Reading Odyssey is a structured program. That means when you first read with the child, he could be at level 1, and then you can see the progress to level 2 to level 3 over a period of time. So when they can see the progress of this child, that actually motivates the volunteer to come back as well. And it's not just about the progress itself, because there needs to be that supervision. You can't just throw them inside there. We have the psychologist, we have the social worker to be able to work with them in case, for example, sometimes they may be faced with situation that they can't handle, or they are stuck. They say, oh, this child has so low confidence that she can't even bring herself to read. Then that will be where the coaching comes in, and the volunteer will then gain a skill that they can see, they can use it to perform the voluntary work and help their beneficiaries. So I think there must be I used to think in my younger days that volunteerism must be altruistic, right? We shouldn't expect anything in return. But in truth, I think most of the volunteers gain more than we give. in a different way?
I think I'll respond to it by saying that we have, the way we design our volunteering activities, we are very clear that the easier we make it for them, the more likely they would turn up. So it takes some time to build that, but we really literally offer like you want an internal mailer for your internal circulation, an EDM, yeah, we'll get it done. You want us to track the volunteer hours for you, we'll have a type form prepared for you. You want us to dial in and do 45 minutes of what we call the halogen way, which is like an introduction, so that we can be the ones who convince volunteers to sign up, we'll do it. It's also draws back to the whole point of, I guess for us, because we want a bit more of the volume, because we have quite a number of youths that are going through the program. So we want more air time, more 1 to 2, 1 to 3 time with the students. So that's why we need a lot of volunteers. And to build that, the way we structure our pipeline is to make sure that we have a broader funnel. And so making it bite-sized so that they don't have to volunteer like one full day. If they haven't been volunteering, then the chances are they turn out for the one day is because their boss asked them to do so, like, quite honestly. So we have to make it easy. We have to make it easy for them. And then, so designing it bite-sized is one way of making it easy structurally, making it easy in terms of the flow, so providing all the paperwork, we take a look, like if after 2 or 3 volunteers complain that our form is too long, then maybe we should do something about it, like, to reduce friction, right? Because at the end of the day, I think we understand that they have a full-time job, right? And they have to fulfill those obligations. So how can we make it integrated and easy? And then last but not least, I think as they engage in that process, we do also pay attention to how they connect the dots. Because really, while we have briefed them, when they turn out for the session itself, this is not their full-time job. So I think we give a lot of grace, like they will turn out and go, by the way, what am I doing later? And you're thinking, but you volunteered, you didn't read my pre-read, right? But it's true. So we try to build it all within the structure. And, oh yeah, no problem, give you context, this is the background. When you're in there, you're not thrown in the deep, you have a facilitator who will help you bridge it. And so if they connect the dots and be able to understand the stories behind why they're doing what they're doing, I think it takes for a more positive volunteer experience, and that's how you can build a bit more momentum. And I think the inspiring part or the encouraging part is sometimes some of them who don't actually really want to volunteer at the start, they start to get more involved because they realize, hey, wow, I could see the youth change his demeanor towards me. Like, this is quite interesting. We have volunteers going there, wow, suddenly I feel like I can understand my young person at home better now because they say all this language that I actually have to ask them what this was all about. So making sure that the experience is also, I won't say engineered, but facilitated so that you don't just leave them, then they do what they want, then they leave with whatever conclusions, because sometimes they don't know better. We have had volunteers who just ask us very strange questions that fellow sector people, you understand, they'll say like, oh, can I work and volunteer for the most challenging student, very poor family background, but then very hungry, but still stuck in there. I'm like, okay, I'm sorry, the students don't exist. Because sometimes the students are here because they've lost faith in like, oh, why am I doing this, right? So initially our program teams will get very perturbed. Why you bring us this kind of volunteer? Where's their heart? Yeah, but we realize it's also about connecting the dots and trying to facilitate and telling our partner teams on the program front, like, don't be discouraged. They're gonna come a bit like that sometimes because they really don't know. And if you can just stick to the whole idea of sharing the vision of what we're doing, hopefully they'll catch it. And if they don't, actually they'll fade out also. So the good thing is the system is quite self-sustaining itself. It will phase out people who are not in here for the right reasons. And for some of our corporate volunteers, we noticed that like when they transit jobs, when they have a portfolio change, we'll lose them. We'll lose them for 6 months, 1 year and all. But it's been quite interesting to, like, sometimes we have someone who LinkedIn us and say, oh, I volunteered 3 years ago. And we're like, wow, that's great. They had a good experience one time and they become champions for the next engagement that they're in. So that's something to encourage you, hopefully, that, yeah, it's seed sown, yeah.
I want to ask Ivy one question. How often do you have a volunteer that draw in other volunteers? It's almost like, recommend a friend and you get another friend.
Member get member kind of thing.
We are testing now to see whether we can gamify it, like bring your friend along. So far we find that, because historically we've not been proactive. We don't finish volunteering, then we pass them a referral sheet, like please, in like insurance, show me your referrals, give me your friends' contacts. So we've never done it. We are going to experiment on whether that has any effect. So maybe you could try that out. But we find that it's been very organic. When they have a good experience, they start telling their friends about it. So we have people who write into us, and then we always ask them, where do you find out about our work? And they know, oh, my friend spoke about this. Oh, actually my wife volunteers with you in her company, so I'm trying to check it out for my organization. So the word does go around quite organically, which is great. And so I guess we'll test out different things. I personally feel like those who are, we have some profile volunteers who are they're serial volunteers. They're the kind that if they were to start their own community initiative or even their charity, they'll make it work because they got the business skills, they got the networks. So we also have some that they've chosen to, instead of kind of come up with another initiative, they'll just spend time with us. And sometimes for some of these volunteers, we'll just ask could you help us in other domains as well to engage them further beyond just the volunteering aspect of things. And then they become somewhat informally ambassadors of what we do. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we discussed this morning as well, right? It's a journey. It's relationship building with volunteers. And especially new corporate volunteers, there's a lot of hand-holding, a lot of things which you need to do in the background. That's why volunteer managers are so important, right? Because you need somebody to do all this admin stuff and everything. So, getting a full-time volunteer manager is vital if you want to have a successful corporate, especially engaging corporate volunteers, I think, right? Okay. You want to add anything?
Yeah, so I was just thinking about this point about, I had an ED in the past where I think one of the school wanted to volunteer. And after that initial discussions, he said, I think they can't volunteer here. And I like her thoughts process behind that. She said, if I were to take this youth at this stage to volunteer and give them a bad volunteering experience, they may never volunteer in the rest of their life. Yeah. So how do we ensure that we don't just grab people to contribute, but make sure that whatever voluntary work that we provide for them, even the onboarding process, give them the experience so that they will continue to volunteer for the rest of their life. And it doesn't mean that they have to volunteer in an organization. I mean, it could be after they had a good experience in this organization, they say, oh, now maybe I'm at the stage where I don't want to volunteer with youth. I would like to do some work with seniors. And that can carry on that voluntary work in the entire sector. So something that I'm not quite sure, did anyone had experience where the volunteer had such a bad experience and say, I'm never going to volunteer again? So you see, all the volunteer manager are doing a great job, right? Yeah, and at this part, why I asked about this bringing in volunteers, sometimes we have to be opportunistic. I mean, I'm a volunteer for 1994 until now. Oh, coming to 30 years already. Wow. And sometimes, even our board members, you just share some story and somebody, oh yeah, I wish I can volunteer. Then you're opportunistic. Oh, okay, come, quick, sign up. I will call this to call you, And that's how we got a few of our board members. I think my AMK, FSC staff are there. I think if you see some of the board members, we were opportunistic. They just say, oh, I would like to, and then you grab them. You don't wait for the next moment. Because they're at the stage where suddenly they say, hey, maybe it's about time I contribute back. And really, how do we have more volunteers who will help you to bring in more volunteers? And how do we groom volunteer leaders? Maybe everyone should be a leader so that they can start to bring in, because of their experience that have gained, they can bring in volunteers. Sometimes to the organization, sometimes they can introduce to another organization. As I said, each of us have a soft spot for different things. Some people like children. So in KK hospital where I work, very easy, right? Everyone like to play with children. But if they start to play with the cancer children, they feel very sad. So you have to address some of these issues also. Because in certain roles where it can be quite emotional, we have to be careful. If they end up with a child, let's say, who has passed away, do we need to do the post-traumatic stress debrief with them so that they don't end up, I mean, they were volunteering. I hope that they don't need to seek help subsequently. So the importance of really supporting our volunteers, especially in those roles where it could be very emotional, which is sometimes not easy because even our professional staff get burnt out, not to talk about
There's a training
volunteers.
is important, right, for these volunteers who.
Yeah, it's never easy. I think especially I've heard of stories where people have man hotline, and the next day she read the newspaper, oh dear, this was the caller last night and he killed himself, and they feel actually a regret for almost the rest of their life. How do we ensure that they don't blame themselves for something that it was not intention? They were there to help, but maybe they didn't, well, I wouldn't say they didn't do a good job, but in their own eyes they said, it was my fault. But in truth, it may not. I mean, even if she has done the right thing, it may still happen.
Okay, thanks for that, Prof. Sure. Any other questions? Yes.
I have a problem acquiring volunteers for outreach, but I do not have problem retaining our volunteers. Our volunteers has been with us for 10 or more years. Yeah, and they have been recommending their friends, and we get really quality volunteers, and they really come and support us at the Active Aging Center. So my problem was because our existing volunteers probably are in their 70s or 80s. So if I get them to help me on outreach, it might not be that, because I've tried asking, so due to their age, going up the stairs, knocking on the doors, it's not something that they are forward-looking. As in, like, they will share that, oh, I've joined problem, you know, and to do door-to-door knocking, it is quite hard for them. Yeah, so I have problem acquiring volunteers just for outreach.
So
Yeah.
can you share where you're from?
Oh, I'm Islin. I'm from Jia Ying Active Aging Center, which is located in Hougang.
Okay, so
Thank you.
this brings back to there was an event I worked with ITE College East Nursing. So they wanted to do community screening, right? So obviously the nursing students in ITE are all very young. And sometimes really, again, what is the fit? You wish to reach out to this group. And of course, the school also would like to do CSR. The nurses also like to be exposed to what is in the community. So I'm always very impressed by the IT nursing students. They're fantastic, you know. You ask them to meet at 7:30, they'll be there at 7:15 in the morning. And what was interesting is, while they work with the RC to do that, so the RC could be your AAC, for example, to do the drop-in where residents can come down to do their blood pressure, their weight and height. They also work out like in the block, okay, which are the ones that didn't come down, because you know where the units are, and they will send a so-called mobile team to go up and talk to them. And I think that time was just after Hari Raya Puasa. So the senior was so welcoming of them that they even gave them tea, cakes, and so on. And what I was told, there was this guy, because it's RC, right? They were seen as pro-government. This is recorded. So I was told that whenever PAP visited them, they always slam the door on them. But when the students went, he actually opened up. And because when they checked, his blood pressure was so high, he actually came down to the RC center to be rechecked again. So sometimes, as we do outreach, do we do the traditional way and then get them to fill a long form, which I know the SGO is getting a lot of our ambassadors to do now, or should we do just a short little assessment first before we do the long form? Because if not, you really put them off. So you can talk to Hot Link about it. So by the way, I'm also sitting on AIC board, so I know what goes on in the SGO. And the screener sometimes can be a killer. And how do we make it easier? I have not looked at the screener yet, but I would imagine how do we structure it so that it's short and sweet, is to make that first connection before they open up for you to ask more. Because if I'm meeting you for the first time, why would I tell you so much of my secret? Even though you are from the silver generation office, right? How do we work with our youth in that structured way? And really, over the last few years, I've seen my medical students, the nursing students, when you bring them down to the community, they are very excited because this is the first time they can talk to a real person without being watched, and there's no right or wrong, and it actually allows them to see what the community, the real person is feeling all the time. Not in the hospital setting when they're lying on the bed and, I'm already so drugged by the anesthesia and you're still trying to ask me questions. But in the community, they get more interaction. So I would imagine for the AAC, one group would be the nursing, like your NYPs, which could potentially play a role, and even SIT now, they have their nursing, NUS, they have nursing as well, and SIT even have allied health as well as your NYP plus ITE. Well, I think ITE is one group we always forgot, but we have quite good experience with the students, not just the nursing part, the buddy-in program where they work with the, I think which school, Meta, where they mentor a youth from Meta actually worked quite well in the past as well. So it also elevates their self-esteem so that they can motivate themselves to continue their studies. So I think that is a win-win situation. Your volunteer is helping to do some work for you, but at the same time, it helps them to grow as a person.
I don't know if I have meaningful input because it's a subsector that I'm not too familiar with, but I'll respond to your question in the following way. I think most of the times there are actually many different modalities or ways to program something. Right? What Dr. An brought up is, for example, reaching out to students. Right? You could also look with, like, if you're very fond of, your organization is fond of using the very asset-based, like, community building, right? Then what are the neighboring interest groups or the neighboring systems? Like, maybe you are engaging with a certain active pool of people, but what if their children, their community? And so if we ideate along different frameworks, right, I think the answer is that most of the time we'll have a lot of different hows that we can ideate, because it can even be a blend, right? Maybe bring students, but then have your older volunteers whom we've retained. They have the richness of the story. So it's first orienteering them by getting them to learn how to connect with someone older before they can kind of do a practical and deploy it. So there are many hows, and I think the way that historically what we try to do is we ideate on the house, but then we kind of prototype and test it with the ground audience because it has to match their motivational interest. So for example, for the students, if you are going with a community CCA group, great. Like, there's ways to perhaps make it more routine and more stable and sustainable, because within a CCA structure, they are sort of mandated already. But the value add could be they really, really want to learn these soft skills because they might be applying it for their CCAs, that's why they joined it. Or in the case of like nursing school, this is ways to help them also build some ground experience before they decide whether or not they want to take the pathway of becoming a full-time nurse or go through a nursing course. So each group has their different motivational interests. And I think that part has to be catered to when you design your final how. That's the best way to help them see also the win-win. So like when we recruit our youth volunteers, we're quite unabashed to tell them, like, it's okay, you want to learn your leadership skills, right? But you have to communicate and learn effective communication. When you come down to facilitate, we would give you training and you get to learn leadership content, but then you will apply it. And that's also a process for you to grow. That's how we're going to invest in you as you give back to a cause that you're passionate about. And I thought maybe there is also a skill that we're trying to remind the organization to to always go back to is also to just basically speak to our users a little bit more. There might be a lot of stories or interests that or uncovering the motivational basis of where what got me really interested, what keeps your volunteers, the older ones, like just committed for years and years to the cause. Because I think there might be some gem in there that that's basically the kind of profile of people that you want as your volunteer core. Our frame of volunteering revolves a lot around for youth, by youth, and you can get to, it's just something compelling that they want to go back into work with their juniors and pay forward what they have learned. But that's a very important alignment of what drives their volunteering motivation. So I think there are some gems there. For my team, sometimes we forget we always just come out with a new program and launch it, and then we have to remind them, actually, why don't we talk to your existing base of volunteers? Why do they keep coming back? Because if you can figure out in their words why they keep coming back, you might have a better understanding of that language of, oh, this is why I stand out in a profile of audience or volunteer like that, and that's what I need to amp up and focus on a bit more, because they are in this for the cause, but also for these other sub-reasons. They just enjoy working with us because we're very fun. And yeah, that's good enough, for some people. Yeah. Actually hired our first full-time volunteer manager in 2017. So at the start of this year, we hired our second headcount. So we've been trying to grow and sharpen what the volunteer and the community team does to be able to engage a large part of the volunteers. So on an annual basis, I think we have 1,000 to 2,000 volunteers that come through our doors. The fun fact was the number actually doubled last year, because the interesting thing was during COVID, we had a digital mode of volunteering. So we had a big influx of volunteers. The irony is that now that the economy is opening and everybody's doing revenge travel at work, our numbers have dropped quite a bit. So we're okay, really just constantly learning how to adapt to the environmental situation when it comes to engaging volunteers for our work. Yeah.
Thanks, Ivy. I think we are also in the middle of fundraising, and realize fundraising volumes has also dropped, and probably due to the revenge travel and everybody is spending going overseas. So anyway, this morning, I think, and this afternoon, we heard the importance of how we should engage corporates and how that's going to help us in terms of our sustainability. So at a higher level, I think we really understand. We really have to see how we can involve corporates more so they can volunteer as well as donate to our causes. So for this session, we thought to have it more on a nitty-gritty level or the operations level. So we would like to really open the floor to you for you to share your pain points, your questions that you have burning questions you want to ask about how do we engage corporate volunteers, how do we recruit them, etc. Maybe share with us, the challenges you face, some of the challenges you face, and then we can see whether we can help you with some of our answers to experience. So I'm opening the floor to you. Any questions, please feel free to raise your hand and I'll pass you the mic. Or you don't need the mic. Anyone? Or maybe I can start the ball rolling first. We have a list of questions. So maybe, I throw it to the panel. What are the ideal volunteer partnerships? What are ideal volunteer partnerships to you? Can you name a few successful volunteer partnerships for your organization?
Quite honestly, I was hoping you won't go through the list of questions, because I struggled with some of the questions, because I would describe our volunteer journey as there's really no way to attain ideal. Ideal has been ideally we come out with this plan and people come flocking in. It's not been that way. The earlier group asked the question about how do we go about building that process, and probably I'll respond indirectly by what's ideal, right? I think there isn't. We started with engaging volunteers with the whole notion that okay, if we want volunteers, we structure it like that. Then because it's youth and education, it's a competitive cause, people will come lining up to volunteer, right? And honestly, it wasn't that. When we first decided to kind of reach out to ask volunteers to come in, we felt that there was still a lot of challenge in terms of how we design the volunteering roles to fit what our primary audience is corporate volunteers. We do recruit youth volunteers as well, but I'll focus a bit more on the corporates because there was a dialogue session on that. And we found that we had to do a lot of maneuvers and learning, iterative learning, to be able to come up with something that will look ideal to the corporate partners. So earlier in the group, I was sharing that I think fundamentally there are a few core principles that we look at. One is learning that we need to learn to speak their language. A lot of our volunteers or corporate adult volunteers come in to do coaching or mentorship roles for our young people. And when we first started reaching out to them, we realized that they are primarily and understandably focused on their work, right? Because they need a schedule that fits their work calendar. Because for us, volunteering sessions are actually within work days. We don't do weekend sessions because it follows what a student's calendar is in school or in the SSA. So we had to mandate like weekdays. But then when we said, here's the list, no one turned up. Being able to learn to speak the language has been really helpful. We have a lot of corporate partners, there are MNCs, banks and all. So we understand like they operate by calendar invites. They operate by understanding what are pre-reads. So we send pre-reads for sessions. We make sure that we build the structure in a way that we brief them even like 30 minutes before we start the session so that they have top of mind recollection of what they're gonna do in the next few hours volunteering with us. And so I think the part about understanding their internal CSR language, their corporate language has been really helpful because funny story, like last time when you used to pitch, after 1 hour of sharing what we do, they're like, oh, great, sounds great. So what do you need from us? And I realized everything that we presented, right, it flew past their head because we didn't speak specifically to basically saying, I need volunteers who would do this. We were just painting the cause, maybe too abstract. So I think learned a lot of lessons about the learning their language so that they understand what we're trying to convey in terms of our needs. The other bit was also being able to be thoughtful about how we design the volunteer roles. So in our program, one of our signature programs that requires a lot of volunteers is actually a year-long engagement where we have about 8 to 9 sessions across the year where we would ideally like an adult to come in and do some work sessions with the students. There has been to date no volunteer who can come and commit to 8 and 9 sessions in a year. Because when we tell them, hey, it's 8 to 9 sessions, they will appreciate, wow, very good. You know, you have someone to follow through, but they can never commit it. It's too overwhelming for their work calendar. So what we have decided to do after going through a few rounds and realized, no, this is not working, is that we redesigned how the volunteer engagements would look like. We wanted still to have some people constant in the classrooms because that builds the relationship with the young person. But we also wanted warm bodies. We wanted all these working adults to come in and share their expertise and share their experiences. So we decided to redesign it where we have our own youth volunteers or interns or our staff to be the constants of the class throughout the year, but then avail the opportunities for volunteering as more bite-sized modes. So you are able to volunteer with us even if you just come for one session. And that made a huge difference in terms of the take-up rate. The good thing is some of them, after they attend one session, they realize, they come to their own conclusion that actually the more frequently I come, the better. But again, it's not ideal. So usually they will say that, but they might still have to prioritize their workplace schedules before they turn up for another session, maybe 2-3 months down the road. For us, I think it's a comfortable, you can call it a compromise, but I think we see it as, we'll redesign it smartly so that it can cater to the audience that we really want to get on board. And I think that part of that redesign is going to be important, and if we have people who are doing the volunteer management function or that dedicated role, it might be a conversation with your program teams on how are there ways to creatively structure or restructure these opportunities to make it easy for people to get started. And then only you have the luxury, after you have people who get started, to talk about retention and growing the journey. there was one other sub-point under design was that actually we have to be quite thoughtful about which audience you approach also, and you have to make certain choices around that. So for us, for example, we wanted volume. We wanted to make sure volunteers can turn up on a weekday, and it is mostly office hours. So one of our primary strategies was to go for the bigger organizations who can afford maybe at least a rep or someone who does CSR or has that volume where they don't mind spending 2 hours one Friday just to do a team thing. So we avoided or we deprioritized those ad hoc drop-ins, people who just find us on a website and they sign up, because that was most suitable for the kind of volunteering program that we have structured within ourselves. And then when we were able to build that pipeline, we kind of applied that same methodology for other things. So for example, if you are looking at other skill-based volunteering or other mentorship programs that we have, then we use the same principles and we kind of design it in a way that we can capture a different sub-demographic of corporate volunteers who come through our doors. So that's kind of like, yeah, it's not actually ideal. It's just, I'm just describing chickening out and telling you there's no ideal, but there's a process that we try to optimize and work with what we've got. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I agree with Ivy, you know. Ideal is like an illusion, right? You can never reach there. And I really think that it is really down to the right job fit. First, the organization have to look at what is the role that your volunteer can play. I know some of you may have gone through the volunteer resource optimization and then see what are the piece of work you can cut out. And from there, you will then have the a la carte list of volunteer work that someone can play. I was just sharing in the previous session, I have met volunteers who say, I enjoy stapling, filing, you know, we wouldn't think a volunteer want to do that, but someone may actually like to do that, and you will deploy him to interact with the senior, he may run away from you. There's no truly right or wrong volunteer work, but we need to understand what is the job fit. It's like when I apply for a job, we have a job description. Just now, I think the speaker said about volunteer description, right? Oh, who was it that said that? Somebody else. Anyway, so in fact, I was at Montfort Care, the Good Life, and I met a retired nurse there. And guess what? You thought she'd be doing, you know, medical checks, but she's doing cooking. Because now that she's retired, I think she enjoys cooking rather than doing the nursing work that she used to do. So while we know that she's skill-based, because we have sort of ingrained in our head now, right? You say, oh, you want skill-based volunteering, nurse equals medical care. But nurse may enjoy cooking, and that may be what keeps her going. And she's buying the raw materials, going there to cook every week, and she's enjoying that process of interacting with the seniors there. So how do we make sure that the volunteer that comes to you is going to enjoy the work that they are going to put in? I wouldn't call it work, they are really put in their time. And what is the impact on their life? To them, they may like to see the smile on someone. And we also have to understand what their fears will be. Maybe someone don't like to volunteer for seniors, maybe because it reminds them of the mother or father who passed away. They prefer to deal with young children. So having that understanding before taking them on is important, because sometimes we say, oh, my KPI is to recruit so many volunteers. They say, hey, this volunteer don't fit, but never mind, just take in. But would we do a disservice to this volunteer? Because if he has a bad experience, maybe he will not volunteer for the rest of his life. But if you're kind and work, I think we work with each other, right? I saw AMK FSC working in Blossoms earlier on. Maybe we can refer to another SG care center so that they can meet their KPI, yet they can also, you know, sustain a volunteer for a longer period of time. So what we're here to grow a community that cares, not to hit the KPI, although some of the people are, you are so-called paid according to the KPI that has been generated. I hope not. Philip did say that you can go and tell him that you can change the KPI, right? You say, hey, what about the number of referrals? I refer to the other agency that then got taken out, you know? Maybe that would be a better KPI than this. So And by ensuring that your volunteer have a good experience, they may bring more friends. So earlier on, I think we heard one of our participants share that, you know, by having a good experience, she got one of the senior who is a volunteer after 10 years. He got almost the entire family to volunteer when they decided to do a new project. And that's also my own experience when I've seen different volunteer group sustain a longer time. Some of them may stop volunteering at the youth. After a while, they say, oh, now I want to work with the seniors. Then the whole group shift to the seniors. But you shouldn't feel sad that they left you as long as they're still in the sector. And that maybe sometimes, could we facilitate that along the way? I mean, AMKFSC is lucky because we're a multi-service agency, so it's easier. I can shift from senior to youth to, you know, small little children in the Kids Start. Some youth agency may be only dealing with you, so if somebody wants to do some seniors work, should we then recommend that group to do their voluntary work in another organization? So some food for thought. I mean, happy to take any comments.
Yeah, I mean, I hear it's. I mean, you know, there's no such thing as might not be such thing as an ideal volunteer partnership, but you can always work towards it, and it takes a lot of effort. And you know, I go back to my point earlier is that, you know, all this, you really have to translate your programs into something which corporates understand and make it easier, bite-sized for them to take it in. And all this takes work, right? And you know, this is where the job of the volunteer manager comes in, right? Because you know, you cannot just take any program you have and then give it to the corporate. Nah, this is what you have, what we have, and you are supposed to volunteer. And it doesn't work that way. You really have to understand where they're coming from, and you know, cater to their needs, and try and ensure it's a win-win, I guess. Okay. I'd like to try and open it up to the crowd again. If any burning questions that some of you might have, you want to ask now, we can try and discuss it at this session now. Yes.
Good afternoon, all. I'm involved in the Kids Start program. Basically, it's a program that encourages young children to go into preschool, you know, so that they have a good start in life. So basically, I'm trying to recruit volunteers to do chaperone service, because sometimes the parents or the caregiver, they may be hospitalized, or they may be facing issue at home, or some transition that they cannot send their children to school. So my question is, because these are very young children, safety concern is one aspect, you know, and how do we vet our volunteers, you know, to help them fulfill this role. And it's also very, the hours are, you know, early in the morning or in the evening to fetch them back. I like to get some tips from the panel.
Thanks. Ivy?
What we do with youth, so not kids. But then I'll probably speak to what I think is transferable, because there are certain themes. We don't have the ability to background check individuals, because the reality is we do a couple of things. First of all, we try to make sure for those roles, the form is very hard to fill, because if it's just send me your LinkedIn invite and then you can be enrolled as a volunteer, then I don't know whether you're truly interested in it for the right reason. So structurally, we try to make it not so easy, because you want some ways to build some tiers that people who are not in it for the right reason will drop out, right? The downside of it is that your funnel will be narrow, but for certain programs that are very important, we try to make sure that the barriers of entry is higher. When we started with our programs, we actually didn't really take in individual volunteers, because we had people who send us resume and tell me how I can volunteer, I've got lots of expertise, and then they make us do the work. Then we say, oh, thank you, and then we just don't reply their emails after that to see if they fade out. And then there are also some that will just sign up, but then we looked at their LinkedIn profile and it's like maybe started 4 enterprises, have not heard of any of them, and then we find that the person's a bit odd when we try to meet them. So when we started the program, we didn't take the individual route. What we tried to do was to go down the corporate route. So the hypothesis was, if I look for an organization that has a slightly bigger pool, like be it like a bank or MNC, they have an established process that they, let's say in terms of hiring, right, they do a bit of that background check. When they filter the volunteers, they can also tell you like, you know, you can actually restrict and say, I don't want volunteers that are like just started at your company for 2-3 years. I want the more senior folks. So we try to lean in on certain structures because there's no way we can go to partner with the police force and say run their NRIC and then like see whether they are legit, right? So there were limitations. So we chose not to actually take on individuals. So we went through either referrals or people that you really know that are very committed a long time. And then we also went the more corporate route because the ability to tap on that and actually some of these companies, because there's been also scandals or issues before, some of them are actually more scared than you. Before they sign on any volunteering, they ask you, do you have a child protection policy? Do you have this form that your volunteer will sign? They'll be actually quite concerned because that gets them into bad rep also. So I think that might be a good place to think about it. I was just mulling over very specifically what you need, chaperones, and yeah, I'm just thinking, ideating only, more like, is it the corporate route and working with the young parents or the parents within a company? There are some companies that are really good at like this flexi working and they avail a lot of opportunities for their own staff to make sure they cater for their children before and after. Like, would there be a way to make it an opportunity to do that? Or should it be more, because I would think there are geographical locations, right? Should it be more partnering schools and maybe family support groups because there's more system? So essentially what I'm trying to say, I don't have the solution, sorry, I'm not a technical expert, but we basically go with systems rather than individual because we don't have the ability to screen them. I think besides the barriers of entry and besides finding channels that we can lean into so that there's some self-screening in that process, I think the idea of how to design it also is important. So I don't know the technicalities of it, but like in our case, if we were to particularly run a certain program, we may need, ideally, we get very good volunteers who can run the program on their own. But because we are not confident they can do so, we'll just take a hit in terms of we will always deploy one person for this program and then have more assistants who are volunteers and still sacrifice or make the call to have one staff to be on that program and outsource other elements that I can outsource because of the nature of how sensitive the cost might be. And I think there are just a few permutations to play around to see what might work. And I don't know, to think creatively, would this be something that, yeah, I was thinking of schools, I was thinking of some of the maybe more well-endowed famous preschools. Like, I know Interhouse has actually a charity or community fund that they do projects also. Like, are there ways to kind of innovate within the system of people who already have a vested stake in that? Yeah. If not, like if it's not something that the organization can take up, because this one I think is very tricky, ultimately is a young person that you're basically stewarding. Maybe it has to be a way where we can help the families build that ability to tap on their own networks or their relatives or community to be that chaperone, right? So it means you don't own the whole process of that. You give the autonomy or the agency to parents to say like, why don't you refer me to people that you trust who can do that for chaper? But I'll give you the structure, I'll give you the support to orientate them and let them be the ones tapping on finding volunteers in this case, because I just find it a bit tricky when it comes to the younger ones. But yeah, those are my few ideas.
I know Kidstar is under MSF. I sort of heard that they were trying to come up with some ways to so-called screen volunteers, especially for those who work with young children, but I'm not sure if they've instituted that. I mean, this is a problem that's perennial. We always worry about not just children, youth as well. because I ever interacted the police and they said there are some of those who were working in the preschool in the past, they didn't have the proper screening, they were pedophile and they end up committing again. But I think that has been solved by instituting that checked. Like what Ivy said, could you work with organization? Back of my mind, I'm just thinking, why don't you work with Grab or Gojek, you know? And then all these private hire vehicle drivers, they all have a police check on them before they are allowed to, and they have a vehicle, so that makes it easier for them to transport. Taxi drivers, I think for sure they have to have a clean criminal record. If not, they won't be allowed to drive. The other possibility to risk mitigate is like what we do with social worker. When they do home visit, you need to go in a pair. So to reduce that risk. So if you have a more senior volunteer and a new volunteer that you want to keep an eye on, at least going in a pair, you are reducing that risk to this child. And that will be one of the way we can help. I mean, I guess these are not things that happen commonly. Or could it be a staff with a volunteer, for example? Because it is always good, especially when it comes to vulnerable children, to have a pair rather than one person. Even our professional staff sometimes can be the perpetrator as well. So how do we make sure that we do the risk assessment, and then what are the measures you're going to put in to mitigate the risk for such issues? Yeah. I don't know, has Grab instituted the in-vehicle recording of sound yet? If that can happen, I mean, that could potentially help. I know in China, what is that? The Grab equivalent in China, they actually record everything that's in the car. TT, yeah. So they actually record all the sound that goes on the car. So something to think about. But again, once they're out of the car, what happens? Because chaperone, you can't just drop them off and leave them. You probably have to go to the home to pick them up. And yet, it also comes back to the point: does this child sleep alone at home? He needs to be put in some safe place as well, I guess.
Okay, I hope that answered your question.
Yeah.
Thank you. Open up to the floor again. Any questions anybody might have? Otherwise, I have to ask from the dreaded list. There you go. Yeah, sure.
You can see your face. I think what attracted me to this seminar is the quarrying part. Because I just took up the role as a volunteer manager in December. Yeah, so I'm only a couple months old. I'm basically still an infant. So, but in that sense that going through what my predecessor has done, she has actually done quite a fair bit of inquiring the corporate clients. So my point, because I used to work in the banking field, so how do we get our clients is we go grab our clients by presenting our business ideas, what we call business managers, right? So my question to the panel is, do we still do that? Do we go out and it's like a pool of fishes and we start fishing and then see what we get? Or do we, how do I do it? Because right now I'm in this state, do I go get, or do I throw out my fishing rod and see who grabs it first? Because I'm not only looking at corporate clients, looking at schools, looking at even preschools all the way to universities, which I'm getting in. That was basically by chance, because they knock on the door. So what are the chances, right? I mean, we don't get this kind of knocking on the door all the time. So how do we acquire them? Do we court them? So to speak, do we fish them, or do we, because I'm actually at the junction where do I go? I'm from Bram Center.
I will respond from a lens of like, this essentially sounds to me like a bit like a, okay, pardon my corporate lingo, but like a bit like a marketing problem, right? Essentially, because there's no doubt whichever role we take on for volunteer management, really there's no ideal, they don't come queuing, you really have to knock. So the short answer is you have to knock, correct? It's just been a, I don't know how many times I did the corporate deck until like I feel like I'm just like, oh, this is the 100th time I'm going through this slide, yeah. But I think there's no running away from some knocking, except that there are smart ways to knock if you first can go back to the core principle of what are the volunteer roles that you're designing for, and who is your primary audience. So the way I think about it in a very pragmatic term, right, is like, okay, first of all, I'll go to my program team and say like, what's your volunteer need, you know, and they tell me 1,000, 2,000, 300, whatever, and what are the different roles that you actually need. And I actually prioritize according to which are the big rocks first, because the ideal at the starting point is just really to get the volume. Without the volume and without trying out the whole process, you don't have the ability or luxury to think about retention, referral program, and all that fancy stuff. So when you prioritize the different marketing strategies in that sense, the channel that is picked is largely congruent with who are the volunteers, what are the profile of volunteers that you want. So for us, for example, when we started riding up the volunteer momentum, we were very clear that we wanted a pool of corporate working adult volunteers. And the best way to get scale is first to look at companies who can actually afford their employees' time off to volunteer. So by that, we go for the MNCs, we go for the banks, we go for the tech companies, we go for larger organizations. And then again, going down systemic that way would be to look for the CSR opportunities or to look for referrals. Sometimes it's just someone who's in there and probably it's great because you were formerly from the industry, so you can actually ask, hey, by the way, do you know anyone from this bank who does this? And get the referral to speak to the right person. And we basically, for us, we write in and we ask for an opportunity just to share our work. And I think the mentality is really that regardless of whether they become volunteers or not, it's just an opportunity to share the good work that the team does to more people and raise awareness for that cause. So I think that healthy mentality makes the 100 times less boring because you're basically trying to be a mouthpiece at the end of the day. And in that track, I think what we did was we just played around with trying different ways to structure our deck in a way that can resonate or speak to the corporate audience the best. Now, if you're looking primarily at youth audience, then you probably have to work through systems like working with tertiary institutions, working with schools, or maybe the nature of your volunteering, you actually ideally want CCAs. You want groups of pools of students who already join a Rotaract club and to be part of something more sustainable and giving them some space to co-create on projects. Then you might need to go down the other channel. If you are trying to get more organic, ground-up volunteers, so we do the few things that are hygiene check. You have a listing on giving.sg. It has to be somewhat updated. Doesn't have to be perfect. You should have a page that lists. We write JDs, job descriptions for volunteers, because we found that the corporates understand that. Our youth don't They always tell us, oh, so what do I have to do? And we're like, there's 4 pages worth of content there. Like, can you just read it? So I think the channels can be prioritized according to your volunteer needs and the demographic that you would like to work with. And there will be many, many ideas. So for example, I was sharing the previous group that if your work requires people who are more like flexi, like freelance coaching, there's quite a big community with the International Coaching Federation coaches. We have these people who sometimes write into us cold and say, I am a coach, full-time coach, like I have time, can I volunteer? And so once you've prioritized your audience segments, I think it's just about a limited bandwidth, so you got to put your sequence or priority to what is most material for the organization at that juncture. And the rest is actually just tenacity in knocking. I was sharing in encouragement that we do have volunteers who volunteer with us. They work in a full-time in a corporation, they volunteer with us, then they change jobs or they change roles, so they disappear for like 2-3 years, and then suddenly they'll LinkedIn back to us again and say, by the way, I think I volunteered at this program 2 years ago with you. I'm now at a new company. Would you like to kind of share your CSR work with us? So that's where the organic then comes lah. So I think if you do a little bit of audit of what the organization currently has, maybe there's a rich pool of existing volunteers who will be your mouthpieces to refer you already. But then on a strategy level, kind of prioritizing where are the, house on burning fire, right? So you have to sort of like, which one is most acute first? And I think then the priorities of the channels can then be easily mapped. Then we work with our comms team to say like, I know you feature a lot about causes, but can I do more stuff on LinkedIn because we really want more corporate audience to kind of come and be a part of our programs. Yeah.
I know Brahms does a lot of mindfulness, wellness program, and you already have a very steady stream of people who are going for your programs. Now, could you be thick-skinned enough to say, would you like to volunteer? And was that useful?
There's always, let's say, out of 10, you might get 10. Actively, you might only get 2. So, but the joy is you manage to convert 2 out of 10. So, I understand that, the percentage is not high. But sometimes, after a lot of knocking, it becomes very mechanical. I'm starting to do that even after a couple of months.
Yeah, but it's the idea of the funnel, right? So you need to have,
It's how to make it creatively fun.
right.
I'm going up ideas, it's like, how do I make it fun? Every time when I do a presentation, it's something new. Until I'm going up ideas. It's like, I don't want to sound like a broken record. I don't want to sound like recording. Sometimes I just go through motion and I say, okay, just say. I need to pause. I said, let's have a break. And then I'll go through, okay, I didn't know what I just said, and all that. So, yeah.
So it does sound to me it might not be acquisition in terms of you don't have ideas of what to do, but probably sharing this other group is a muscle that we're trying to keep reminding ourselves. There is a tendency that we'll structure everything and then we'll push it out and then we expect people to like, wow. And I think if you have that 2 out of the 10 that actually get converted, it might be worth also talking to these people who are part of the 8 or the 2 to understand what was the main reason why they became the 2 or the 8. And I find that when we have a bit more conversations about understanding our current stakeholder audience, they give us a little bit of insight to how we can structure that. Because you don't know whether the dropout could possibly be that they just didn't really understand what volunteering entails. It felt like that facil that they saw in the other class, which is like walk around only and distribute paper, I don't want. And they will just tell you no, because they will not explain. They might just tell you, oh, I don't have time. So it's actually good to find out a bit more. And for the tools that actually came in, maybe they are just super interested in the subject matter. And maybe they have their all community. I know the mindfulness thing is also a growing buzzword in many corporates. So for all you know, they have some other focus interest groups that they can refer other converts who like that subject matter to become involved as well. And I guess that is that potential source of information that needs to be tapped on. Then you get a bit more insight on the nuance. Like for us, for example, no matter how sexy the cause is for like, oh, I saw in a young person, we notice that generally the corporates, even they say that our C-suite wants to be involved, they're actually not the best audience for our students. Because they are, by nature of their mentorship for their other staff, they're generally very big picture. And sometimes a young teenager who just wants to connect cannot like, oh, yeah. So it's also inside data, right? Because on the outside, I'm just looking for corporate working adults. Your leadership wants to be involved, that's great. But then there's also the underlying behavior or motivational or the nuances that gives me more insight on what makes a person have a really fruitful volunteering experience with us. And there's really no right or wrong. It's just that we have our own style, we have our own way of structuring, and we tend to attract these crowds. And only if you find out the 8, that they give you reasons that you're like, okay, that's really bad. Maybe it's a program issue. Then it'll be another tough conversation with the internal stakeholder to go like, can we change the way we engage so that I can also build the pipeline for engaging people on a volunteer basis?
Just checking you, when you give those mindfulness talks, right? Do you give it at corporate sessions, at corporates, or at Brown Center itself?
Our principal facilitators do, I mean, she does a lot of corporate mindfulness programs. I think they were a lot more attracted to her than volunteering.
Right.
So, because she is the face of Brown Center. So, it's a very big shoe to fit, you know, especially in volunteering things. So, which I'm trying to get her, and then you have to gradually step down so that, you know, I don't have to literally chase after you. And then it's how I say, and then try to key down a bit when you're trying to paint the picture. You are painting such a beautiful picture. I don't think I can only sustain like 70% of it most of the time. So the rest of the 30%, that's the dropout, you know. They say, oh, you do what you can. But it's still the managing the expectations, you know, and she does it beautifully. I mean, I give her credit. But when they come to the job itself, sometimes it's, oh, was that tough? That's a 1 hour program, takes us 2.5 weeks to plan, and it ends up like within 45 minutes, and we all like sweat and tears and, you know, and complaints and all that. But that's the part you don't see. You know, that's the part that I sell, which before they know about it, they're like, I'm really sorry. So that's hence a lot of dropout. So I believe in tough love.
Wow.
Yeah, what I mean by tough love is I don't paint you a perfect picture. I show you what I literally give you a trial. This is how I work. You're like, you know, do you guys do that? I said, yes, this is our everyday life. You know, not only for you, but for the volunteers as well. So we give them firsthand. But you know, for the corporate ones, I think they only think about. I mean, you know, during the seminar, I think Speaker Tan said, not telling them, not doing the yes man thing. You know, we don't just accept your arms and all that. So I'm a believer in that as well. So don't give me something that I don't need. Rather you give me something that my beneficiaries will benefit, right? Sometimes they just don't say. They just one track mind. This is what I want to do, and this is what we'll do. You know, it's like going to the Gardens by the Bay 4 times a year, and you cut it. You know, it's like, yeah, I've been there. My seniors like, I've been there before. It's like, do I have to go? I said, no, you don't have to go. But do you want to go? Why not? Free one. You know, I got free food. You know, I got drinks. I'm free anyway. You know, so but it's not what impacts the seniors. But because I'm actually when I started off as a volunteer. You know, then I took up the customer service role. Then I was also a trainer. I was also a art and craft teacher. So at the same time when I was working, I was also volunteering. So I understand where you're coming from. So it's very difficult to get trainers. So I step in. You know, because I'm a full-time staff there. I can't run over it. I said I get COVID and I'm sick. So I understand where you come from. It's very difficult to get trainers to, you know, especially volunteers, because they're not governed by hours. So last minute you can say, I can't make it. My kid I have to go to school, I have family crisis. So it's difficult, you know. So try to go into the corporate partnership side because they are more stable. You know, no matter what, they will still commit and 20 volunteers for that quarter, you know, and the designated dates. Hence, you know, getting to them it's not been
Easy.
it's been an uphill.
And sometimes when we think of corporate, I think we should also think of organizations. I mean, as you were talking, it reminded me of what My Science Center did with the Aging Well Everyday program, where the Kwang Ming San actually adopted it. And because they adopted it, actually it's all volunteer driven. They came up with the course, they run the course on a weekly basis. It's not easy. I mean, even My Science Center has hard time trying to find new groups. Actually, not just trainers. They basically train the trainer program, and actually the organization runs it on itself after they are trained. So whether the model would have to evolve because yours is a very intensive program, you have trainer, now you have volunteer trainer, can I train the trainer where then the beneficiary become the trainer? So that whole engineering of some of the way you reach out to the beneficiary, I'm not quite sure if it's mindfulness, I guess it's possible, but I do know Brahms run I think seniors, the active aging in McPherson, right? Yeah, so that's where I think you have two very separate kind of function, which makes it very, I guess, a bit schizophrenic for you as well. The mindfulness is one part, then the active aging is another part.
Yeah, it's a bit kind of fighting against each other, in a good way. So I don't know, when they volunteer, it's a different thing. So they ended up, she said, oh, I just want to cover in your retreat, which we don't really have very often. Maybe like 12 or 14 a year. But I think what we're trying to acquire is volunteers or partnerships that can come in for our seniors, because we are more getting involved. Yeah. Let's be very frank, when everybody talks about Brahms Center, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
It's mindfulness, right?
Program.
So,
yes, I volunteer. Do you only do mindfulness? No. What do you do now? They're like, you what? So, and then we're also doing youth programs right now, which is a very new arm. They say, you what? We offer counseling program. You do? And also, I was like,
branding issue.
It's like, I'm not the only one that knows about Brahms Center.
So, AMKFSC face similar issues that you have. The branding actually sort of like ties up to one place, right? And even though we're making the acronym, people always like to expand, Amokyo FSC. Although then when we say we are in Punggol, then, huh? What's AMKFSC in Punggol? And then sometimes we're in Sengkang. And hence sometimes that narrative that you have to drive makes it difficult. I mean, we are also in the process of rebranding ourselves. It's the same as I saw Teresa's, they put down there Ernst & Young. When Ernst & Young don't exist anymore, it's EY, right? But what did we do for her title when Teresa was moderating? It's still Ernst & Young. How do we change that branding so that maybe you have to call it another name, because Brahms Center has been so successful in mindfulness that nobody associate you with seniors or youth work anymore. And that can be, itself could be a problem, because your original organization branding was so strong that it's stuck in everybody's head,
I mean, I personally feel that there are so many initiatives and so many SSAs and so many charities around that I'm not discouraged. My skin very thick already. That's the main thing about joining the charity sector. It's like, you haven't heard about Halogen? No, we're not a light bulb company. Because that was the when I go and oh, you're not a light bulb company? No. Awkward. Yeah, can I tell you about our youth programs? So I think still the branding bit and the awareness bit is something that still has to be built either way at an organization level. And I think if you have someone who's driving and very powerful and known to be, actually that person can be a really good, effective mouthpiece, to really articulate that there are more arms than this. But it sounds to me that either way, even with the branding and they are aware of the range of work, it's still that there's still a gap between where you can find adequate volunteers to fit the roles. And I think I see it more as where we have to put on our creative and innovative hats a bit, because even if we say we work with corporates, because everyone in this room might want to work with corporates, but there are many, many, many types of corporates. Some of them, you want to work with them because eventually if you can adopt us and just give us money, actually we'll take the money. We don't need your time.
That's the best,
it's okay,
best one.
Right? Or there are some I have had corporates who tell me oh, can you come out with a volunteer program on a Saturday that is not out in the sun, and then you can engage with youth, and I'm horrified, right? But there are many different subsets, because the corporates can mean your SMEs, it could be your startups, because we approach some of the startups entrepreneurs to not volunteer, but share their story in some of our programs that are related to the subject matter. You also have that whole pool of people who are doing gigs and coaches in the coaching economy. Like there are many subsectors, quite honestly. So if we look at corporate as just corporate, and then I pitch and I hope that then we shortchange ourselves from the multi-dimensional facets of looking at where this pool of corporate actually is. And like example for mindfulness, like actually I think there's a lot of momentum on the HR and the people culture bit for mindfulness. The previous round, there was a lady from Halfway House who served women. Actually, there is a great momentum on diversity, inclusion, and equity in all these corporates. They have their own women chapters most of the time. So corporates can't be just the be-all and all. There are many subsets, and we have to identify which is the subset that speaks best. And I'll go back to the part of the who are the two people who stay, because when they say, oh, I would like to volunteer for a retreat, the practice that I'll go back to my team is that that's not enough. Find out more. Why are they interested to run the retreat? Are they interested because later on they can, build their knowledge around mindfulness because they find it's an important practice, or they're trying to be a coach. So at one point in time, they're trying to learn more about that to pay forward, or they have benefited from mindfulness practice and they just want to pay it forward. Or they just love organizing things. Like when I was young, when I volunteered, I actually volunteered because I like to organize and plan things, not necessarily because I was happy to be the front line, in all honesty. So, but what's the motivation? So when we find that out, then we understand, like, yeah, to Dr. Ang's point, he was saying, like, you won't be surprised that you may have volunteers who love to photocopy and do manual work and behind the scenes work. We also have volunteers who, I don't want to do frontline, but then, by the way, I'm an ops and audit expert in my company. Y'all got audit help or not? And now finance person is like, yes, finally someone wants to help me with this thing that nobody really likes, because not fun, ma. You rather work with a youth than an audit, right? But he is quite the contrary. So I think understanding what makes sense, and we're quite unabashed, like with the young volunteers that come in, we'll tell them, look, we'll train you all, we'll help you all build facilitative skills, we'll give you all the leadership content that you must first learn, then you can churn it out and digest it, and then pay it forward by running class trainings for other youth. This is for learning and growth for you, and then you pay forward what you know for the community. And I think many of them come in first because there's an opportunity to learn something around leadership content. And that's totally fine. Like, I think we talk about it quite openly. We're like, it doesn't matter how they come in. I think it's more about giving them a positive experience and helping them see what they could do in a different way. So I do have some companies that, like, they love to do like back-end work. So maybe people who would look at the process of planning and go like, I plan this for my whole life. I'm in a career in planning events. Here's the way you should actually restructure your run sheets, deal with your logistics, and streamline the whole process. Maybe they'll volunteer in that way too. So I suppose we have no choice. We've only got this terrain to operate, right? So if we can put ourselves more in the innovation and ideation space, I think we will be more encouraged than discouraged, which is what we actually need, because it's not been very easy times moving out of COVID now. I think I mean, I still feel the fatigue, quite honestly, but it's just, we have to just find a good way to move forward for the people that we serve. Yeah.
And I was just chatting earlier on, we should remove this term called volunteers. Volunteer is like a former job that I apply for, but what you're trying to create is a more caring society. And one of the program that AMKFSC has been trying to do in a localized way is your asset building community development. Truly getting people in your community to be part of your center and to have that ownership. So we had one community hub in Ang Mo Kio area. So it was one of those temporary CC that I shifted out and we took over. And interestingly, when they went through the whole process of going to the neighborhood to ask them, okay, what, if this is your space, what would you like to see? And the renovation for I think almost half the void deck was about 20,000, because some of the staff say, oh, I'm a carpenter, I can build the cabinets, I can do the piping and so on. And when I visited that center, I saw a young couple in their 30s. I was like, usually I see old volunteers, right, in such centers. And I asked, why did you volunteer? And he said, because I thought this is in my community and I want to be part of this. And when we start to hear this, one of the volunteer used to throw tantrum at one of the FSC. She'll go there, lie on the floor, scream and yell and create a havoc and give the staff a lot of headache. When they got her involved in this community hub, guess what? She got all her friends to join. And now she don't create trouble anymore, but she bring in volunteers. And whether we could start to rethink the way we so-called recruit volunteers. Instead of recruiting volunteers, we are going to get the community to be involved in the center where you are without officially calling them volunteers, but truly they are coming there out of their own will. So I would consider them volunteers, yet they are also the beneficiaries. And when you have something like that, why we call it asset building community development is we are going there to say, what is it that you have you can contribute to this center? And when they come to you and say, oh, look, I have these skills, rather than, oh, you don't have this, I give you this, then after a while they become disempowered. What we want is an empowered community that will then thrive in the long run.